Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear students. It's a great pleasure to continue our Macau history and heritage series, public lectures that have been hosted over 2 semesters now by Rui Cunha Foundation. Today, our presenter, I would like to introduce Professor Priscilla Roberts, our colleague at the Department of History and Heritage. She's going to have a public lecture today entitled Macau's First Modern University, exploring the early history of the University of East Asia. But before we start the public lecture, I would also like to invite Mr. Rui Pedro Cunha, and as the head of the Department of History and Heritage, I would like to acknowledge this wonderful collaboration that we have had already for 2 semesters and multiple public lectures that have attracted attention of general public and academic public in Macau. And I think this has been a very fruitful one. And as a token of acknowledgement for this wonderful collaboration, I would like to present you with this gift from University of St. Joseph. And it has light. So thank you so much. And we hope for further collaboration. And
let me tell you,
yes,
it's been an honor having this cooperation with USJ. I think it's going really very well. And we can see that by the number of people that always come to these lectures with USJ. So thank you for USJ for organizing this together with us. It's our pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming.
Let's just take a photo first because I think they didn't.
Okay, let's take a photo. And now, dear guests, dear colleagues, I would like to present our speaker today, my colleague at the department, Professor Priscilla Roberts, who I have also pleasure to know since my work earlier at City University of Macau. And Priscilla Roberts is an associate professor at our department. She's a British-born historian, educated at Cambridge, King's College, and she holds BA and PhD degree in history. And throughout her academic career, she has also researched different aspects of international transitions of power and the role of the elites as private individuals and through institutions in the making of foreign policy in the US, Britain, and the British dominions. She spent many years at teaching at the University of Hong Kong, and she has held many grants and fellowships from bodies in Hong Kong, United States, Britain, Canada, Australia, and Macau. And since moving to Macau, she has also developed a strong interest in the territory's history, and that's what probably also unites us in this interest in Macau's history and heritage. She has also developed a strong interest, and especially in terms of its global significance. She has produced multiple books, single-authored, edited, and co-edited books, and numerous journal articles and book chapters. Her latest book is Voices of World War I, Contemporary Accounts of Daily Life, New York, published by Bloomsbury Academic. Professor Roberts, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much.
We have the PPT. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that very generous introduction, Dennis. And thank you also for all you've been doing to help me settle into the Department of History and Heritage, where I think it's now 10 weeks since I arrived. And you've been a great and very helpful colleague. And yes, I will get all that stuff put up on the website in the next few days. I've been waiting until I'd got this out the way. Well, today I'm giving a talk about Macau's first modern university, the early history of the University of East Asia. And given the venue today, I am in particular going to be talking about the Portuguese contribution to the University of East Asia, founded in 1980, officially founded in 1981, but a project whose roots went back much further. And some of those roots were very much in Macau itself, and some in Portugal. And so I'm beginning today with the fact that on March the 17th, 1982, the Portuguese Consul General to Hong Kong, Pedro Manuel dos Reis Alves Catarino, a man who would go on to have an extremely distinguished diplomatic career, came, which I'll tell you about a little later, came and gave a talk at the University of East Asia, which is described in their bulletin as the diplomatic and consular action of Portugal in the Far East and the possible roles of Macau and the University of East Asia in that context. I have to say, that seems to me a rather clumsy title. This is from the English version of the bulletin. I do hope that in Portuguese it was perhaps a little bit shorter and more to the point. The Consul General, I tried to find early photos of him as he was then, as opposed to later in life when he was the Portuguese ambassador to China, the permanent representative at the UN, the Portuguese ambassador to the US, and also the head of the Portuguese delegation to the Joint Liaison Group. And I'm afraid that's the best one that I could manage. Him toasting Stanley Ho in 1982, about the right time when Stanley Ho had just received a Portuguese decoration. I also have another more dramatic one of him in a hospital bed about the same time when he and his wife were attacked by intruders in their magazine Gap home in Hong Kong, and he was stabbed several times. It made the front page of the South China Morning Post, but I thought that was perhaps a slightly more respectable looking one. And there are actually several origin stories of how the University of East Asia, which most of you probably know, was the forerunner of 3 universities in Macau today: the University of Macau, City University of Macau, and Macau Polytechnic University. It was like an amoeba. It split in 1991 to 2. There are different origin stories. One is that Hong Kong businessmen, aware that university places in Hong Kong were in very short supply, were keen to make money by providing opportunities for Hong Kong students to study full or part-time for degrees, and because the Hong Kong government wouldn't let them do so, they decided to try Macau instead. The second, told me by a Chinese friend, is that Liao Shengzhe, a Chinese intellectual who was a close friend of Sun Qingling. He actually helped her and quite a number of other prominent people to escape from Hong Kong to the mainland in the late 30s and early 40s, where he himself was a communist operative. He went on to become a head of Xinhua, the founding president of Huaqiao University in Xiamen, and also the first head of the Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office, that he pushed on behalf of China for its existence and got red capitalists in Hong Kong to line up behind it. Thirdly, that founding a university in Macau was a project the Portuguese officials in Macau supported in the 1970s, but at first lacked the funds and resources to support. So all these impulses came together. And today, given the venue, I'm going to be focusing particularly on the Portuguese side of the story, looking at the role of the Portuguese Macau government and the local community in establishing and supporting what was at first the private University of East Asia. The university's place, as Consul General Catarino's speech suggests, in Portuguese soft power strategy for education and culture in the region at that time, what the early university contributed to the development of studies of both Macau and the Portuguese-speaking world, and why the Portuguese or Macau government took over 3 of the colleges of the University of East Asia in 1988, and then 3 years later renamed it the University. The University of Macau. Well, we have the story of the governor and the engineer. In 1974, a young military man was, in the wake of the Carnation Revolution, appointed governor of Macau, José Eduardo Martino Garcia Leandro, still around today and on various Portuguese-Chinese friendship bodies and bodies concerned with Macau, particularly, I think, the Jorge Alvarez Foundation in Lisbon. And he met a young engineer, Wong King Keung, at that time often known as Peter. I think he's more or less dropped that now. A Hong Kong U and Queen's University, Canada graduate who worked on a reservoir project in Macau. I think there were problems with leaks and shoring it up. They got on well. Leandro had launched ambitious plans to develop Macau, a blueprint that included extensive reclamation and development, including building an airport. I've met Eduardo Tavares da Silva, a military engineer and architect who came to Macau in '69 and with the military and remained here until the present. He recalled that when they drew up a development plan, he himself wanted it to include a university and had even pointed to the hill on Tai Pa where the university would eventually be built as a suitable site. But much to Tavares' disappointment, I think largely for financial reasons and also because they were afraid Macau was too small, had too few students to support a university, it was missing from the development plan. By the 70s, Hong Kong's higher education system did not suffice to support all the people, the young people in Hong Kong who wanted to get a university place. There were plans for a third university and another polytechnic and even possibly an open university. But in the meantime, there was a big shortfall. At that time, as many Hong Kong students were studying outside Hong Kong as in the territory. 3 young Hong Kong businessmen saw the potential to fill this gap, of whom Wong King Keung was one. The other 2 were Peter Eng and Edward Wu. He apparently impressed the young governor enough so that Leandrew asked him to suggest potential projects. A university was one of these. Here are the 3 founders later on, with the first rector on the left and 2 of the most eminent Hong Kong Chinese academics, former Hong Kong U academics, who came over and taught at the new university. Brian, I expect that you remember Xiao Tsung-yi and the other gentleman whose name slips my mind, but they were both very eminent Chinese scholars. And the 3 founders, when they set up Ritchie Island West, showed great skill, to my mind, in getting the movers and shakers in Hong Kong, important business interests, especially those such as Sir Albert Rodriguez and the man de Salas, who only died recently at the age of 100. They lined up important business interests in Hong Kong and Macau. Behind this, Ho Yin, who was at that time still Mr. Macau, and was the first chairman of council. And apparently, Ho Yin had to convince Stanley Ho that this was a good idea. Stanley Ho was not very keen on it at the beginning, according to Wong King Keung, who ought to know, but was later convinced to back it very strongly indeed. And Ma Man Kay, who became the next chairman of council after Ho Yin's death. And so it was an early experiment in public-private cooperation. In the late 70s, Macau on its own was too small to support a university. So there were economies of scale to be gained by permitting students from elsewhere to enroll, either those who couldn't get into Hong Kong universities and so would come to Macau as full-time students, or also part-time students. And I think there were a lot of diplomatic negotiations behind the scenes, which we still don't know fully about. The founders and the Macau government signed a formal agreement to establish a university literally just days after China and Portugal had re-established diplomatic relations after 30 years of non-recognition. Basically, the government provided the land, some of the personnel, and there were very careful understandings about what role the Portuguese, the local and Portuguese government would play in the university. In fact, the head of the Macau Board of Education, Tulio Thomas, was just about to retire, and he became the liaison with the Portuguese government and also held various positions in the new university, ending up as a vice rector. And there you see him. You also had on the planning board not just Tulio Thomas, and I apologize that I haven't got all the accents here, by the way. PowerPoint wasn't very good at doing this. The rectors of the University of Evora and the Catholic University of Portugal, the Bishop of Macau, and also Father Manuel Teixeira, whom I'm sure some of you remember. Here you see them. they very quickly, when the university started awarding honorary degrees in 1984, both were given honorary degrees, one in 85. I think here Father Teixeira was ahead of the bishop, in fact, which I'm sure is not proper religious protocol, but nonetheless it happened that way. One of the first degree holders, however, was Stanley Ho, who was on the planning board, I think, a member of the UEA Council, chairman of the UEA trustees, and a generous donor. Through the CRED-DM, he gave over 20 million, or raised over $20 million for the university, quite a lot of it from his business associates, a group I've christened the Friends of Stanley Ho, who likewise got honorary degrees in the next few years. And the founding rector in 1980 toured Portuguese universities, returning with offers of cooperation, especially in Portuguese studies. Shui himself had been very much involved in establishing the discipline of public administration at Chinese University of Hong Kong. He'd also taught at Hong Kong U for a while, had very good relations with both rectors, and also in the broader Asian region. He was involved with several regional organizations, and he had been rector of Nanyang University in Singapore, and so brought in various people from Singapore and Malaysia. Why was Portugal willing to support the new university? Well, by 1980, Portugal had embarked on a campaign spearheaded by the Camões Institute, which took over what had been the Institute for Promoting Portuguese Culture and Language in 1980, though confusingly, I find in the records it's still referred to as ICALP, to disseminate Lusophone cultural and educational influence across Asia. And between 1980 and 1985, the Institute sent no less than 4 historical cultural missions to Macau and the East, each of which submitted very useful reports on the state of Portuguese culture in the area. The new university featured prominently in these, though ICALP was also supporting a lot of other projects in Macau and the region, each of which has a nice little file. The Institute donated over 500 Portuguese books to the University of East Asia. When Rector-designate Shui returned from his visit to Portugal, he also asked it to send someone qualified to teach Portuguese language, studies, and culture to the new university, and said if the university could pay for the teacher's salary and travel expenses, the university would provide accommodation and an office. He wanted a 4-year appointment. The first candidate pulled out at very short notice, so they instead sent a senior professor, former colonial administrator, Rafael Avila de Azevedo, who worked on a study of Portuguese culture in Macau that was published in 1984. He was from the Azores. He'd written extensively on Portuguese education in Africa and elsewhere, and had also spent 6 years as a member of the Portuguese National Assembly. He actually spent 3 years. He left due to ill health in 1984 and was replaced by José Miguel Ribeiro Lumey on secondment from the University of Lisbon, who spent, I think, 5 years in Macau. He'd been intended as a second person to back up Azevedo, so was already on his way, and they asked him to expedite his departure. That's him in later life. That's him on the right-hand there in the picture with the second rector and Governor Carlos Mellancia, and also one of the honorary degree recipients later on. This would be, I think, in 1987. And both Azevedo and then Lumey sent regular reports back to Lisbon about exactly what was happening in Portuguese studies in the university, lists of the books, the courses that were being developed at the university, and the broader progress of the University of East Asia. So the Portuguese archives are actually quite a goldmine for particularly Portuguese studies, but also the broader development of the university. This is one of them, submitted by Lumey. That's the first page of one of Azevedo's reports. Azevedo sent back quite a lot of letters, especially in his first year or two, every month or two, detailing what was happening. It was, of course, a very new university at that time. It goes down sometimes to course descriptions and lists of exactly which students were enrolled in courses. Anyone who's interested, I'll be happy to tell you more about that later on. Or you can come and talk to me and get in touch with me. So Macau's new university was seen as significant, not just in terms of what it was doing in Macau, but also as a base for the dissemination of Portuguese culture around the region, a place where conferences could be held, for example, bringing in scholars not just from Portugal, but also from elsewhere in the region. So it was really part of what would now be called a soft power strategy of boosting Portuguese influence in Asia, and also developing long-term good relations with China and other Asian countries, while upgrading Macau itself. I haven't, unfortunately, at least yet, been able to dig out Catarino's talk in 1982, but I would say that other countries also took a big interest in the university, but so too did the Macau authorities. Here you have two of the top officials in Macau who were involved in the university's affairs. The governor of Macau, Vasco de Almeida e Costa, who spent 5 years here, and then a well-known figure in Macau for many years, still very much involved with the territory through the IIM, in particular, Jorge Rangel, who's held many different positions in Macau, but at that time was Secretary for Education, Culture, and Tourism. Many of you probably know him. Others certainly know of him. And those two came together for the university's first birthday in March of 1982, which was celebrated with two big official events. On March the 16th, there was an international tree planting. 17 diplomats from 17 different countries planted 17 trees to replace trees destroyed by fire 2 years earlier on the site. They were intended to symbolize international cooperation and cultural interflow. Part of UEA's original contract required it to maintain a balance between buildings and plantings. And every year, the foreign consuls came over for an annual lunch with the governor. They then adjourned to the campus of the University of East Asia a year earlier, when it was officially opened in a ceremony at the Jaya Lai Stadium. It was still a building site, which was why the ceremony was not held there, though anyone who was interested could be bussed over to take a look around. Here are the consuls involved, not, as you see, the Portuguese consul. He, however, was there the next day giving his lecture. And here you see one of the consuls, I'm not quite sure which, planting a tree. I do rather wonder what kind of state they were in after what was presumably a good lunch with the governor, but nonetheless they managed to plant their 17 trees. Macau was beginning to develop and was seen as offering interesting economic opportunities, both in itself. There were a lot of contracts for reclamation, building the airport, it was hoped, and backing the new university was an easy way of developing links with the territory. So the University of East Asia was a way of getting a toehold. It hosted visiting professors financed not just by Portugal, but also by France, Germany, Japan, Princeton in Asia, and the Fulbright Foundation. And it also got a lot of advice and assistance from the British Council and the UK Open University. Donald Swift, the first head of the Open College, was on secondment from the Open University, and two of the first English teachers had worked for the British Council earlier. Now, Caterino gave his talk the next day, and then 2 or 3 weeks later, you have the official opening of the university campus. The governor comes back and declares the campus open, and there is a major program of events. There were speeches by the governor, Ho Yin, and Rector Shui. Various plaques were unveiled. I once tried to find these on the campus of City U, but I'm afraid I couldn't. They seem to have disappeared. Stanley Ho presented a large cheque for the construction of the cultural centre, which it was hoped would become a venue for other events in Macau, cultural events, things like, as it did late, concerts, theatrical performances, public lectures. The foundation stone of the cultural centre was laid. The library building, financed by a major red capitalist from Hong Kong, was opened. And then at 3 o'clock, Dr. Jorge Rangel launched the first open day for the Open College with a 3-day display of Open College learning materials. So here you have the Macau government officially assisting with recruiting. Here's Rangel in April 1982. They also allowed the university to use the Leal Senado to recruit Macau students. I'm not quite sure if this is 1985 or 1986, but it's one of quite a number I have of that particular event. So the university is very much identified with Macau right from the beginning. And this was something that UAA's founders and rector did their best to show appreciation for by cultivating the Portuguese and Macanese community. The very first honorary degree went to Governor Vasco de Almeida e Costa, who also became UAA's chancellor, and at the same ceremony, Rangel, the rector of the University of Lisbon, Stanley Ho, and Ho Yin posthumously also were granted honorary degrees, and it's a pattern that continued over the next few years. Here you see Rangel in his robes, and here you see various honorees on stage at the third congregation. I think we've got the bishop here, also sorry, I'm supposed to use the pointer, Stanley Ho sitting next to him. Sorry, I'm not making a good job of this. Never mind. Yes, Stanley Ho, the bishop, Dr. Tulio Lopez, Thomas Tulio Lopez, Marman Kay, who picked up an honorary degree in the second or third round. There they all are on stage. It's very much Macau's university. And here I've got a list of the next honorees. Cho Wen-sin, Cheng Yu-tung, and Chu Tak-kei. These are part of the group of friends and business associates of Stanley Ho. And then Dr. Cristoval was actually head of the Institute for Promoting Portuguese Culture and Language. Now, I've got a lot to get through, so I'm going to skip over. Yes, the next governor also picks one up. This is basically a way of saying thank you to all our friends in Macau, from Portugal and beyond. There is Carlos Augusto Monjardino. So they were very keen to make it clear that they greatly appreciated the support that they were getting from the Macau government. These became big events on the social calendar of Macau. And they had good reason to do so. The government had given them the site. In 1986, they got 5.5 million patakas from the Macau government to help building the Ho Yin Convention Center, a joint venture planned since 1984, which had several smaller but still sizable lecture theatres that could provide a venue for something not too big but not too small, that you didn't want the really big cultural centre auditorium for. And that's what the university looked like at the time of the Portuguese takeover. You've got the convention centre on the right, and that's the entrance to it. And there were other areas of academic cooperation, various agreements signed with various universities. There was a 10-day academic conference in late 1983 on the Portuguese presence in the Far East. There was always teaching of Portuguese language, but in 1986, bachelor's programs in Portuguese studies were established at the university. I'll skip over the history of the fountain, which was presented to the university. I can always come back to it later if anyone has a question. I think this is the replacement fountain. It's not a beautiful tile fountain. It was, unfortunately, it looked like bad luck, and I think there were a couple of palm trees behind it which looked like incense sticks and made it even worse. And on at least one occasion, UEA produced a special Portuguese version of its newsletter, which again I found in the Portuguese files that a research assistant in Lisbon, one of our postdocs, very kindly went through for me. It was usually published in English. There were 5 issues. I've managed to track down copies of all 5 of them, but that's the only one I've seen in Portuguese. Possibly because at that time they were considering funding a second position in Portuguese studies. So this was all very good press. Now, the big game changer came when Governor Melancia decided to take over UEA in 1987. By then, they had a new, very high-profile rector, a Chinese-Canadian, Paul Lin Ta Quang, who had he'd been a very bright young student at Harvard in 1949. He'd gone back to China with his wife. They had close family connections to Sun Qingling and also to Liao Chengzhe, whom I've mentioned to you. And Lin had actually taught at Huaqiao University for a year at one point. Lin was basically Mr. China in Canada for a long time, involved with pushing for recognition, academic exchanges, business exchanges, the development of business contacts. He applauded the Sino-Portuguese joint declaration on Macau's future, but this impelled the Portuguese government to take over UEA's Macau-based operations. Governor Melancia, attending the second, I think his second convocation, at which he was sworn in as Chancellor of the university, made a speech in which he said that a private university couldn't do all that Macau needed, and there was going to be a lot more funding through the newly established Macau Foundation for it. I don't think at that time Lin, who left a very bitter account of it afterwards, realized that this meant that they were going to take over the university. He merely thought that it meant there was going to be a lot more Portuguese government funding, or Macau funding for it, to fund ventures that he had mostly started anyway or was contemplating. He'd established centers of Portuguese studies and Macau studies. He was planning programs in public administration and law. So you might think this was a marriage made in heaven. However, Lin was not going to take orders from the Macau Foundation, which was at this time headed by Rangel, a man a generation younger than him, who I think he did not respect. And so when he discovered that the founders were in negotiations with the Macau government to take over the university, he announced that if this happened, he would resign. The founders, I feel, were under very, very heavy pressure. Well, they've told me that they were under very heavy pressure indeed from the Macau government to sell out, basically. The government did not want the open college or the graduate college or the press that they'd established, but it wanted University College, the junior college, and the Polytechnic College, and basically talked about nationalization. And I've been told by one of them also that they wouldn't get any more land and the government would take back any land they hadn't built on. They could sell at an advantageous price, or it could be nationalized. Well, when your landlord makes that kind of overture, it's very difficult to say no. And apparently, Madame Soares, who visited the university, invited by the governor to attend the first music festival, about half of the events were held there. You can have a look at the program as well, if you wish. She was shocked by the lack of teaching of Portuguese language and culture in local schools. She visited the University of East Asia and is shown here inspecting the library. So what happened next was that Lin did not leave quietly. He walked out of the handover signing ceremony at the governor's mansion because he was seated in the second row. I've seen his papers from that time. There was constant, very bad-tempered and acrimonious wrangling between him and Rangel over various issues, particularly over funding for the first anniversary symposium of the Centre for Macau Studies that he'd organized. In the end, Stanley Ho offered to advance 1 million patakas if necessary for this event. I think in the end he got it back. Here you have the two men at the final congregation, press reports on Lin's walkout. What happened next? Well, I would say that all hell broke loose, quite honestly, particularly in terms of Portuguese studies. In 1987 and 1988, ICALP had appointed 2 further Portuguese specialists in UEA, Daniel Pires, who's gone on to have a very distinguished career, back in Portugal mostly, and Luis Rebelo. In late June of 1988, the former rector returned in a caretaker role, which he'd hold for the next 3 and a bit years. He was also head of the East Asia Open Institute, the bit that still remained to the founders, sharing the same premises and enjoying some kind of ill-defined affiliation with UEA. First of all, there were battles with among the Macau Cultural Institute, the Macau Foundation, and ICALP, and the university itself as to just who should be funding the 3 Portuguese specialists, with Matt Macmillan, the Dean of Arts, actually a British academic, speaking out forcefully in terms of retaining the Portuguese funding of some kind for these positions. And also he didn't want the Cultural Institute to take back all the electronic equipment, teaching materials, and so forth. In 1989, the Centre of Portuguese Studies held its first seminar on Portuguese culture in the Age of Discovery, and President Soares visited UEA to open the newly established program in public administration and have a big meeting with academics and administrators, complete with a model of the university's future building plans, in which he explained plans for the future. It didn't stop a great many of them jumping ship very soon afterwards, I'm afraid. Many of the international scholars had either reached the retiring age or they left. They went with the East Asia Open Institute and later moved on elsewhere. In September of '89, a very senior Portuguese professor, whom perhaps for reasons of diplomacy I won't name publicly, came to UEA on temporary secondment for 2.5 years, 2 and a bit years, from his normal position to reorganize Portuguese studies, which became a separate department of Portuguese studies. He remained until late 1991. He organized several further seminars, the last in autumn 1991. He brought with him a number of bright young graduate students, at least one of whom has again gone on to have a very distinguished career, has taught at Brown University in Portuguese studies. Within 2 months, the 3 Portuguese specialists who were already funded by ICALP were writing furious letters of complaint to their sponsors. One is 6 pages long, saying that it was impossible to work with him, that he'd broken off all contact and links with the Faculty of Arts, that whereas UEA had been a happy international group of people working together, he now insisted on transacting all business in Portuguese, including all communications with the rest of the administration, in overseeing all teaching that had anything to do with Portugal, whether language, literature, history, and he threatened them with dismissal before their contracts expired if they did not accept his policies. I think he'd probably been brought in by Rangel. So there was an exodus. 2 of them left, I think, in 1990 before their contracts expired. The third, who was more junior and didn't have anywhere to jump ship, stayed until at least 1998 when he got his master's degree. The professor himself returned to Portugal at the end of 1991. He did publish 2 or 3 further books in Macau with the Cultural Institute, the Macau Foundation, etc. Within a few years, his graduate students also moved on. And in 1991, the split became formal. The University of East Asia was reorganized as the University of Macau. The 3 publicly owned colleges were split. The Macau Polytechnic Institute split off with Rangel as its first president. The East Asia Open Institute left the premises, became affiliated with the Portuguese Open University as the International Open University, focusing increasingly on the market for part-time degrees and students from mainland China, though it too had a director and group, I think probably center of Portuguese studies, chaired by a Portuguese woman who arrived in the mid-90s and stayed around until about 2010. And I've actually found a little cache of books that belonged to her tucked away in the basement in the FOB storeroom, which Jose suggested that I should look at. I went down there about a year ago and dug through a lot of old boxes of papers and books. This was part of a broader exodus of personnel, particularly the international staff, during this transition period. A professor of English and communications, known to the Duggans, one of an American couple who taught at UEA and then the University of Macau for 6 years in the 90s, recalled that the English department was the black sheep, with Portuguese and Chinese departments enjoying the blessing of the administration. I think this meant that they could fight at the heavyweight level instead of the lightweight English department level. So did Portugal's soft power strategy for Macau succeed? I would say arguably yes, in terms of the territory serving as a long-term bridge between Portugal and China, and also later on between other Portuguese-speaking universities, which I think is an area in which the Macau Forum is now also doing well. But I do feel that the heavy-handed way in which it was implemented, especially in 1987 to 88, when Paul Lin and perhaps the founders as well were treated with a degree of high-handedness that was perhaps not necessary, also fragmented and weakened Macau's overall higher education system, and that's perhaps a legacy which can be seen even today. This is the university as it looked when it was taken over in 1988. I found in the Macau Historical Archives a collection of around 400 photographs documenting exactly what the university looked like, what was in the library, the bookstore, everything, even the rooftops and all the stuff that you find on roofs in Macau. And I think that this was a kind of stock-taking of the university by the new owners to see just what they'd got, maybe even to send back to Portugal to make it clear what they had bought from the founders. So it's an interesting story. It's been one that I'm still trying to piece out. The university was only one of various cultural ventures in Macau. There are lots of files in the Torre do Tombo about little events or smaller events that also got funding. And in the Camões Institute files, there's lots of material, clippings in particular, big fat files of clippings on everything to do with culture in Macau, events funded by the Cultural Institute. So I'm hoping that at some point I might be able to recruit a graduate student to do a master's or even a PhD thesis, digging into those files in much greater detail. Today, this is very much work in progress. So I've been sharing with you material that I myself am still sorting out all the complexities involved. Anyway, thank you all for coming. It's lovely to see quite a few very friendly faces here, some going right back to my Hong Kong U days, and some from some of my colleagues from City University of Macau, as well as my new colleagues from the University of St. Joseph, and all the other people who come to the Cunha Foundation events. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Roberts. Well, of course, there were a lot of interesting details, but I remember, I think at one of the events that you organized at CTU, and where I had also pleasure to participate, I discovered that there was a banknote, actually, of 20 patacas,
50.
or 50 patacas.
I didn't bring it along tonight, sorry.
That would be a very interesting artifact. And I think that also shows how pivotal the university was in emerging infrastructure, educational, cultural, and as an institution, of course, the splits and other tensions led to this, maybe, as you say, weakening and fragmentation. I would like to invite the audience to comment or maybe raise any questions, address the speaker.
Priscilla, thanks for an interesting talk. Going back to what you said about the nationalization of the Who actually organised it? Was it the Portuguese government or was it from Macau? Or do we know?
Well, Melancia arrived here shortly after the signing of the joint declaration on Macau's future. I don't know if it was his idea, if it was Soares' idea. I really, that's above the pay grade of the people in the Camões Institute as to how it was decided to take over the university. So I think it was probably Melancia who seems to have waltzed in, I presume took Rangel under his wing. They seem to have got on well. And he was in Macau until, I think, May of 1992, while all the problems in terms of Portuguese studies and people jumping ship and the reorganization were in progress. So I don't even know whose idea it was to bring in this very senior professor, who is still alive, by the way, in late 1989, who basically managed to alienate the existing staff, and it sounded as if he managed to alienate most of his other colleagues at the university as well. But I won't tell you who that was, but I honestly don't know whether it was a decision taken in Macau, in Portugal, or both. Probably both.
Any more questions? Comments?
Thank you for your sharing, Professor Roberts. So I have a question because I'm curious about the timeline. Like, why it happened during like 1980, but not like a bit earlier? Because I saw like one of the assumption for the third one is like Portuguese governor is about like 1969 or 70, something like that. Yeah, thanks.
Do you mean establishing a university? I think when they started out, they didn't have probably the population base of interested students in Macau to support a university. And they also didn't have the funds to support it. The government gave land rather, and then it was up to the founders and the Ritchie Island West Company how it was going to be funded, and they were running quite substantial deficits and debts at the beginning. And I found some of the papers from those as well, also down in the FOB basement. Very interesting basement. They're no longer there, by the way. At least a lot of papers are still there, but the ones that seemed most historically significant to me, I brought up, and they're now in cupboards in the FOB. It does leak when it rains, and I feel that the buckets strategically placed to catch the raindrops perhaps aren't the ideal system in terms of archive management. So this meant that if the university lost money, this was a problem for Ritchie Island West and not for the Macau government. By the mid-80s, there's more money around, not just from the casinos at that time, but also from property development in Macau. So there's more money sloshing around to fund this, and Macau students are also, there are more Macau students in the university. I found some figures which I brought along. Did I bring? No, sorry, I looked at them before I came along, which show that I think in 1987, the number of Macau students enrolling in full-time programs for the first time surpassed that of students from Hong Kong. So it was a more viable project by then. They'd got a group of teachers established, and they did in fact hire quite a lot of bright young teachers around 1990, some of whom stayed on for the next 30 years or more and became mainstays of the University of Macau. So there was a big changeover in terms of personnel at that time. I think it was partly a matter of economics, but also that the Portuguese government wanted to use the university to train administrators, to take over the Macau government, and to set up a law degree, law programs as well. In fact, the president of future president of Cabo Verde, the politician and poet Jorge Fonseca, actually taught there for a year from 1989 to 90, which I didn't mention, I didn't have time. So I think that it was a matter that the university was now sufficiently viable. There was a big enough catchment within Macau as people got used to the university, and a potential catchment of students from China as well, that they could afford to keep it going.
Thank you. Actually, very interesting document that you circulated. There were so many fellowships provided by the banks. Well, at that time there was only one casino, but so many fellowships and grants to students. How has this changed? CTU.
And I think even at the beginning, Macau students were in a preferential position for those.
Please, any?
What did Hong Kong people come to study in the university?
Because they couldn't there weren't enough university places for them in Hong Kong.
What did they study?
Usually business.
Usually business. Thank you. Yes.
Do we have any more questions or comments? Or maybe some comments regarding the documents that were circulated? Well, yes. Well,
I also, in fact, have here, this is the speeches that Soares gave on his 1989 visit, the official, when they'd just taken over the university, that session where I show him Okay, there he is, meeting informally with the staff. There had been a formal speech before that as he opened the, or gave his blessing to the new program in public administration. It had already been in existence since the previous September. These are the speeches. This is actually Governor Melancia's copy. I'll show you. How do I know this? Because it has his card in it. I think in later life he disposed of part of his library, And clearly this did not seem to be something that he felt a need to hang on to.
Well, if there are no more comments or questions, I would like to thank Professor Roberts once again for this wonderful lecture, and I would like to invite you to share some drinks and snacks in more informal atmosphere. Thank you so much.